Génial. Donc, just to start, merci Thomas Bernard et Carole pour l'organisation de cette conférence. I'm truly humbled to present in front of such a great minds and drawing heroes, so thank you for being here. I'm Samuel Bernier-Lavigne, and I'll be presenting the multiplicity of the line, study of the Japanese one-room spaces through digital drawing. So when we immerse ourselves in the study of Japanese one-room spaces, we immediately notice a discrepancy between the simplicity of their graphic representation and the complexity of the environment they generate. This architectural term, which we owe to Jacques Lucan, characterizes the interior of a single, homogeneous, fluid and continuous space without obstacles of an equal and clear luminosity. By their monospeciality, these projects will only need a small number of lines to produce their blueprints. A good example of that would be the ferry terminal in Naoshima by Sana, where only one horizontal line is needed to express the project. So how can we explain this discrepancy between the simple representation and the complex environment of the one-room space? A first reflection can be made from Robin Evans' inescapable formula, of course, translation from drawing to building, where he explains the fundamental difference in language between the lines of the drawing, specifically chosen by the architect to express most clearly the intention of the project, and the architectural result, where the space and the materiality come to fill the gaps left in the initial representation. It is between these two phases that a zone of uncertainty is formed, where the drawing has intrinsic limitation of reference. Not all things architectural can be arrived at through drawings. There must also be a penumbra of qualities that might only be seen darkly and with great difficulty. However, in the drawings of the one-room spaces, this penumbra gives way to the white void of the sheet of paper, apart from the few lines delimiting the contour of the project. So we must turn to their finality as a building to continue our investigation. So once inside the one-room space, we discover a kind of architectural island, a framing space with the potential to become a dreamlike zone for the occupant, une zone onirique, as would say Gilles Deleuze. It's a space that creates its own world, an interior world within the world, as specified by Peter Sloterdijk. They present a highly diversified spatial environment, an Umwelt, which will disclose different information according to the distance and the scale of our analysis. This is due to the subtle but numerous variations that intrude into these seemingly uniform architectures. This interior island could also be seen as an areolar space, un espace aréolaire, as defined by Augustin Berck in his book Vivre l'espace au Japon. It is an inherently topological space which is conceived as it is at the various moments when one experiences it. There would thus exist as many perceptions of space as there are relations between the subject and the object. So what appeared initially as modest, homogeneous spaces finally tends towards the heterogeneity by their spatial experience, an aspect that was simply imperceptible in their orthographic drawings. These particularities of the spatial environment of the one-room space will be qualified here as the aura of the space. This concept by Walter Benjamin qualifies this fragment of the work, which reveals itself only in the presence of the original in its real context. This strange fabric of space and time is obviously not the object itself, but rather an individualized atmosphere, a subtle but distinct sensation that envelopes the authentic work, metaphorically represented here by a painting by Eugène Carrière, where the art can be seen, but we also understand that there is something else, something more. When applied to architecture, the concept of aura will emanate from a fine understanding of the space through a series of analyses putting in dialogue proximity and distance. For that to happen, experiencing this space is crucial, as it will lead to a sequence of immersion, imagination, and memory, by which an idea of reality will build itself around the aura, rather than only having in mind the reality itself. In order to explore this potential, we will flip Robin Evans' formula, now becoming translation from building to drawing. So the first step in this heuristic process will be the translation of the one-room space into a digital object. The result will essentially be a precise three-dimensional model behind which lies a large amount of data, mainly formal and compositional, a kind of dataification of the original work. As the philosopher UQAM points out, digital objects takes up the functions of maintaining emotions, atmospheres, collectivities, memories, and so on, related to the original object. The manipulation of the data structures opens the access to all the possible modulations of the project, immersing us directly in the technical operation of the capture of form, as would say Gilbert Simondon. And so to access the aura of space, the strategy will be to deploy creative simulations in the digital object, using dynamic systems of particles, shadow projections, and algorithmic loops of mesh decomposition. Each iteration of the simulation will bring us closer to the desired aura, echoing the memory of the spatial experience while moving away from the known reference of the initial object. The final step of this process is obviously the representation of the aura through digital drawing. We explore the abstract space of the drawings where the lines will no longer necessarily correspond to a particular element, but their multiplicity will lead to a general expression of the object in its globality. Thus, the drawing becomes fundamentally speculative, having the capacity to reveal something new. It is the bearer of a poetic of space, and we need to allow the observer to imagine what the drawing is suggesting. From a technical point of view, the different simulations generated in the digital one-room spaces produce a large amount of information to be processed. We will then use a drawing machine, aka a pen plotter, to translate this accumulation of complex data into a multiplicity of lines, dashes, and points. What may seem at first glance like a kind of technological ecstasy is rather a way to bring two worlds into dialogue. First, it raises the question of how code can be used for something other than the generation of architectural forms, and have something to say about the way we analyze and represent architecture. Second, the use of the drawing machine consolidates the fundamental position of drawing in the digital age, using computational power and automation to draw, with a simple pen, countless lines on paper. This preamble finally leads us to the presentation of the drawings that are also on the table, as we explore the aura of the spatial environment of three Japanese one-room spaces: the Kanagawa Institute of Technology workshop by Juniya Ishigami, the Teshima Art Museum by Ryo Nishizawa, and the Naoshima Pavilion by Su Fujimoto. While the existing building of the one-room space is presented as is, its digital version gives us access to its multi-resolutions. A low resolution will present its globality, and consequently, the increase of this resolution will reveal us its detail, its intimacy. This gradation in the resolution will go hand in hand with the continuous refinement of the creative simulations, plunging us into a universe below our thresholds of perception, where it is no longer possible to correctly identify the fragments that are evoked. In this way, a triptych will be produced for each project, through which we will approach the aura while moving away from the digital object by means of abstraction. So first, the kite workshop is clearly the most complex one of the one-room space studied here, hosting a large fabrication workshop program within a forest of 305 pillars. While this multiplication of the column first catches the eye, we will focus instead on all that lies between them, where the spaces appear and disappear like bubbles. As Ishigami mentions, it creates a continuous, transparent, and complex environment behaving like an airflow. We could also see it as a metaphor for the wandering in the labyrinthine streets of Tokyo, whereas Augustin Berck underlines, from this complexity of the path is born the depth of the space. it becomes clear that the aura of the kite is found in these interstices, where the pockets of space melt with each other simply in contact with the ambient air. This fluidity of space will be studied here in the first series of drawing, while a dynamic simulation of particles will be run in the digital object of the kite. In this way, each particle projected in this environment ends up discovering the spatial interconnections imagined by Ishigami, following the collisions with its fellow particles and the forest of columns. Through all these movements, the unseen of lost moments is revealed, as Paul Virilio expresses it, where the precise form of the space is practically elusive, even undefinable because of its non-gridded organization, and changes continuously through our experience of the building. This instability is catalyzed by the role that Ishigami gave to the observer, while a simple move of its position will drastically change its reading of the space. The organization of columns, random in appearance but not in design, creates moments of great visual density. At one point, several columns seem to merge to create a wall, but by simply taking a step aside, we can see through the entire project again, and we then realize that this was only a visual effect caused by the loss of sense of distance. A similar effect has been transposed into the digital drawings of the kite through a change of resolution between the second and the third drawing. So let's say zooming from the global to the local, what seems like a massive element reveals itself to be volatile light, a floating point cloud. We continue our exploration with the Teshima Art Museum, which when viewed from the outside is perceived as an island in the topographic sea of the surrounding hills, as expressed here in the first drawing of the series. The architecture of the project is a wide concrete shell encompassing a single space that seems endless, where its exact dimensions and shape remain blurred to the understanding of the observer. It is due to the paradoxical continuity that this one-room space offers, where our vision of the space is an all-point total. This totality produced by the emptiness of space echoes the famous Japanese ma, which is in an inseparable way space and time, and creates a permanent relation between the museum and the immensity of the landscape in which it is part. So how to make this emptiness visible? We will take inspiration from the horizon of silence developed by the artist Georges Seurat, mainly in his drawings. Known for their blurred figures lost in the shadows, his Conte pencil drawings on textured paper creates variations in density and gradations of tones. This led to a kind of graphic indeterminacy made of black grains clumped together in the drawings that contaminate somehow its ontology. This texture will then be imported in the environment of the digital object to be projected as vectorial data to generate the second drawing of the triptych. This material presence becomes a crucial element of the drawing, here merging at some point the project with its environment, but as Seurat scholar Judy Hoffman points out, the way we come to read their meaning depends almost entirely on absence. This absence, this emptiness of space inside the museum for us, becomes for Seurat his aesthetic of silence, a theme that will be theorized a century later by Susan Sontag. Silence thus leads us to stare intently into the void, to finally discover all that was missed at first glance. And so we get closer to the architecture to explore the fineness of the grain of the concrete composing the shell, in constant dialogue with the gradient of light to shadow. It is then that we realize that a totally empty architectural space simply does not exist. As long as we pay attention, we always find something to see. As Sontag said, to look at something that's empty is still to be looking, still to be seeing something, if only the ghost of one's own expectations. In the end, this silent emptiness turns out to be deceptive. When we let ourselves be carried away by the detail, we discover the fullness of the void, la plénitude du vide. The last series of drawing focuses on the polyhedral pavilion that Fujimoto created for the island of Naoshima. Seen from the outside, this architectural object demonstrates a nice spectral quality generated by an optical effect in which one can clearly read the limits of the form, but in its center, everything becomes blurred. It's caused by the materiality of this one-room space, composed of a white metallic mesh that overlaps at the borders of the object, thus creating a visual density. To understand this mystery, one will be tempted to change its point of view by turning around the project, only to discover the same milky transparency in its center, always framed by this material density, which this time traces a slightly different profile of the complex polyhedron. This ghostly environment is Fujimoto's ambition to rethink the essence of architectural boundaries and can somehow be reminiscent of the characteristics of X-ray images. Once inside, the perception of the space completely changes. The defined object no longer exists. It gives way rather unexpectedly to a complete dissolution of the depth of space. The highly articulated crystalline form now becomes a flattened element, a simple two-dimensional pattern. This effect is accentuated when the white mesh blends with the cloudy sky, but sporadically some shadows manage to break through, and by projecting the external pattern onto the internal mesh, it brings back some three-dimensional reading to the space. And so we find ourselves once again in an areolar space, floating in this world between sky and earth. Finally, this simple membrane of white mesh forming the pavilion manages to express the idea that contemporary Japanese speciality seems elusive and immanent and even ambiguous at times. This almost non-existent boundary between the interior and the exterior becomes the last filter that sparks the visitor's imagination. It is a unique feature that allows the architecture to exist. Without it, there is only absolute emptiness. It then emerges the paradox of the intangible object, this initially autonomous element with precise and defined contours that becomes gradually blurred by the drastic increase of information in its representation. The drawing of the one-room space's aura, using the multiplicity of the line, leads us inevitably to the dissolution of the object. Thank you.
Well, maybe it's a question. There's very interesting drawings, but do you think your drawings are more fascinating or more moving than your experience? You were there, I assume. Yeah. You think isn't the issue in Japanese architecture?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you start very well by quoting Robin Evans in a way that goes against what one usually assumes Robin Evans to have said, which is that architects make drawings. Mm-hmm. Architects make drawings only since the Renaissance and marginally. They only start really believing that they make drawings in the 19th century when they put their patent on a series of, and this is my work.
Yeah.
So it's a very recent conceit. For the majority of the history of mankind, through many different means, architects have made buildings. Yeah. Like the architect of the medieval cathedral was basically the bishop who communicated with the master mason constantly to make a building that had no drawings. It basically was constructed through some techniques. So I think we reduce this very much. Now, you started by quoting Robin Evans in reverse, which is very interesting. But then I think what happens in Japan, in my own experience, is that there is evidence that because of the strong tradition, the Japanese managed to build, the architect builds. And that's what moves us.
Yeah.
Okay, you agree?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, perfect.
But
then I don't understand. Then I don't understand your fascination with reducing the building to dots.
I guess it's a way to express the. Yeah, I guess it's a way to express the. How could you say that? To bring back a bit of the building with us here on paper, but of course, the experience is, the grandeur of the experience is bigger. It's more important in the building, of course.
I'm just bringing this up.
Yeah.
It's enormous.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
A question from Carole.
We can do it in French.
I would have to directly translate, and
No problem.
I don't think my brain will let me. You quoted an author who said that not everything can be shown in drawing. Some things may remain in the penumbra. It's a beautiful idea, but then the question is, where does one stop drawing in order to protect the penumbra, as well as how much needs to be drawn in order to reveal the penumbra? An impossible question to answer, I suppose, since you translate these atmospheric one-room buildings into the digital realm. I have to suppose a certain amount of clarity, if only in the information you put in the drawing machine, needs to be incorporated, but how much clarity? Drawing machines and aura are not an obvious pair to me, so how do you navigate between the two?
I guess it's a bit of the same question that you just asked. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's, yeah, and Walter Benjamin said that it's, with the reproduction of the art object, you cannot, I mean, it's the erosion of the aura. So I mean, the exercise here is to try to bring something back with me from that experience. And this is the way I find to explore also the digital object of it. I mean, you digitalize the project to play with it and to immerse yourself in it once you have left the island of Japan. So that was a kind of exercise that I was trying to do. So maybe I completely missed, but that's the whole point of doing it.
If you,
Sorry?
I was just saying that Carole va faire un commentaire si jamais il y a des choses à rajouter. I sort of look at Michael Young there because I thought maybe you had.
Yeah, I like points. Okay. Speaking on Walter Benjamin, there's another distinction. It's not in the artwork. Did I lose my? I think I might have. Oh, I'm back. Look at that. When he attempts to establish some sort of difference between drawing and painting, and speaks about drawing consisting of lines on grounds, and what that does in terms of structuring figure ground and the bounding contour of the description of space. And then he goes on to speak about painting, and he makes an argument, whether or not whether or not this is true or you agree with him, that there's no lines in painting, that painting is marks and matrices, and that anything that we begin to perceive optically as figure ground is created through color contrast, tonalities, and densities of smaller marks, aggregations of marks. And so there's something incredibly interesting in pairing that then with the penumbra, or the atmospheric of the one-room space that is, and you didn't speak to it, but I'm assuming maybe there's some scanning mechanism either through LiDAR or photogrammetry, which essentially gathers the world as a series of images of points, which then calculates a point in space to become the data that then brings it into the software that we work with. And it comes to this question where, and it's one I'm struggling with all the time, we're okay when we got hundreds of lines, but what do we do when we have millions of points? And it's a fundamental transformation of paradigmatic thinking of what it is when we work through representations. And we're struggling with it, but I think it's a great one to struggle with. And it's, I think, a very contemporary question also with our interfaces with software. And I think to Alberto's point, I think it's going to change the way in which we work through representations in the future. So fantastic presentation and beautiful, beautiful drawings to me, yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. A good plug for your book of citations on the table. Word for word, perfect. One last small comment from Mark.
Thank you. Sorry, it's also a Walter Benjamin point, but I can't help thinking about the opposition that he makes between the aura and the trace. And it seems to me a way of describing your project could be about a project to convert the aura into the trace.
Yeah.
But there's a contradiction there, which I think needs to be worked through, which, I mean, a contradiction that's so extreme that it might even collapse the kind of possibility of the aura, the possibility of the idea of the aura. So, you know, I mean, he makes this distinction between the aura as the experience of a distance within something that's close.
Yeah.
But the trace as giving us the possibility of grasping something that is distant through it. But I don't think the two can be converted into, or at least there's a problem in trying to translate the two into one another, which I think, you know, needs to be articulated somehow in the project.
Okay. No, that's true. I mean, the whole point of these drawings also is to express not necessarily the built finality of it, but to extract what is around, what is the feeling of the space, what is actually the aura. And of course, this is the most difficult part of it. And that's why I use the whole reverse of the formula yeah, you go. Yeah, of course, it's almost impossible to do it, but yeah. No, but how to represent something that is not graspable. So that was the whole point of of the project.
Merci, Samuel.
Thank you.
We have to move on.
Yeah,
Merci beaucoup.